Uh, so I'm not going to really speak much except to thank the Helsinki Commission for putting together this panel. I'm very, very involved and interested, and I think the world is, in what's going on in Ukraine. And I want to learn from each of our panelists about how we are getting information. And I just look forward to listening and understanding, and I'm getting a better appreciation for the difficult task that you have and the important work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Really appreciate your participation, and we will have a Q&A session where I know you always have very good questions, and we're looking forward to your participation. As I mentioned, even as today, as I was just dawned on me then, as I was saying good morning, wishing good morning to everyone, it's with a full realization that people in Ukraine have not had a good morning in 2 months now. And it is, of course, because of this completely unjustified, murderous war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. This war is tragic and infuriating. But this war is also insidious. And I want to make it clear, any war is insidious. But this one is especially so because it is based on the narratives that deny the existence of Ukrainian people, of the Ukrainian nationality and identity, and the utterly nonsensical claims of fighting Nazis in Ukraine. The horrors that we've seen and Ukrainians have lived, frankly, are whether the Bucha massacre, the siege of Mariupol, the shelling of civilian homes, abuse of children and women, are in the name of these completely false and ludicrous narratives that the Russian propaganda has been spreading. I want to make it clear, no far-right party made the parliamentary threshold in the last election in Ukraine. Ukraine has a Jewish president and had a Jewish prime minister as recently as a few years ago. It is also home to multiple ethnic and religious minorities, including the Crimean Tatars, who have been staunch supporters of the Ukrainian nationhood. So, no, and frankly, it's painful to be even talking about it or keep repeating this. Ukraine is no Nazi haven. And despite this insidious narrative is strong, even frankly among the audiences who have access to unbiased information. So we thought we'd bring together a set of diverse voices covering Ukraine to highlight the unity of their narratives about what's truly happening in Ukraine. In many ways, today's briefing is unique. All we want to do, we want to spotlight the voices, let them tell their stories, and for us to listen, learn, and hopefully act. This is the important element. Acting and not just listening is very important. So in some ways, my job today is very easy because we have this remarkable, outstanding panel, people I have been following, listening to, and learning from for years now. But at the same time, it's an incredibly difficult briefing because of the reason why we have gathered here in the first place. I do wish, frankly, it wasn't happening because we are doing this amidst the war, amidst the horror and massacres that are unfolding in Ukraine. So with that, let me introduce our panel. So we have 3 panelists today, witnesses today. Oz Katerji is a British-Lebanese freelance conflict journalist currently reporting in Kiev. He spent more than 13 years covering the Middle East and international conflict with a focus on human rights and open source investigative techniques. We also have Asami Tarajima. Asami is a staff writer at the Kiev Independent. She worked as a business reporter for the Kiev Post until November 2021. She was originally from Japan, but she moved to Kiev at a young age and lived in the capital ever since. She's currently working towards her MBA. Olga Takaryuk is an independent journalist and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. She's based in Ukraine. Olga has vast experience working with Ukrainian international media. Her reports were published by Time, Washington Post, Daily Beast, NPR, you name it. And this is an incredible honor for us to be hosting this panel of witnesses. And I think without further ado, we would like to kick it off. And first, if everybody's fine, I would like to start with Oz because he, I think, brings a really unique perspective. Oz, we're here to learn from you and to listen to what you are seeing on the ground in Ukraine. But I also would like to ask you, since you've been focused on the Russian war in Syria, on the horrors that Russia has been committing in Syria, if you could just also talk a little bit about some of the similarities of the narratives or strategies that you have seen in Syria and Ukraine, and to really drive home the point that what's Russia doing in Ukraine is not some one-off things. This is a systematic effort to eliminate people. So with that, Oz, I'm going to kick it off to you, and please jump in.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Helsinki Commission for organizing this. I'd also like to personally thank Representative Cohen. The letter that he sent recently to the White House about restricting travel for British lawyers that have been involved in some quite horrific cases of basically intimidating journalists from reporting the truth on Russian dark money in London and around the world, and how Putin's network of oligarchs, advance his power and his foreign policy interests around the world. These lawyers have been acting, with impunity for a long time now, and there's no method currently to hold them accountable. And it's really important that the Helsinki Commission has taken it upon itself to make these steps to hold British citizens, British lawyers who have been acting as the legal wing of Putin's Kremlin, Putin's kleptocratic, thuggish oligarchy, to hold them to account for their role in this, because they do have a role in this, and the role is multifaceted. There's the legal intimidation. There's the vast amounts of money that have been spent on media, Russia Today, Sputnik, and various fringe organizations on the far left and the far right that have had dark money pumped towards them to put out Russian propaganda. We have Russian propaganda being broadcast to the American public on right-wing talk shows. It's not just limited to Russian sponsored television networks, but the long arm of this stuff is clear to see, and it has been clear to see for many years now. Onto your question, Bhakti, speaking about the war in Syria, for me, the war in Ukraine was not a surprise. I wasn't shocked that it was happening, and I believed the intelligence assessments. I'm a British Lebanese journalist. I focused my entire career on the Middle East. But obviously in 2014, what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass, these became really important, and I recognized, not just myself, many of my colleagues recognized that what was happening in Syria and what was happening in Ukraine was part and parcel of the same geopolitical situation, and that is the solidification behind a fascist dictatorship in Russia. Putin consolidated power. Russia is now a militarist, totalitarian dictatorship, a revanchist dictatorship with territorial goals. This is something that we considered not a possibility for a great power or a superpower in the post World War II liberal order. It's happened now. We were told throughout history, growing up, or at least my generation were, that no liberal democracy is going to be invaded by a nuclear armed dictatorship, and such stuff is hysterical alarmism. But anyone who is focusing on Russia's actions in the field of conflict can see the writing on the wall here. It didn't just start in Syria. You had Georgia, you had Chechnya. These were the practice runs. Syria was the opening shot, and Ukraine is the continuation of Putin's war of expansion into Europe. And it won't stop at Ukraine's borders unless it's stopped. Putin won't stop unless he's stopped. So let me bring it straight back to Syria. The one thing that we saw Russia's involvement in Syria, they didn't supply the manpower to Syria. That was supplied by Iran's various militias after the Assad regime spent all its manpower, and most of huge swathes of the army defected and joined the Free Syrian Army, formed the Free Syrian Army. So Assad was struggling for manpower, and he required Iran to provide that manpower for him. That still wasn't enough, and in 2015, Putin had to intervene militarily in Syria. Now, again, they didn't provide huge amounts of manpower. What they did provide is military firepower, and lots of it. That firepower was concentrated specifically targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. This was widespread, it's systematic, it's documented, it's been proved by multiple UN human rights investigations. Not that they are worth much in and of themselves, especially considering Russia's UN Security Council veto, which is something I will move on to later. But just to name a few of the atrocities committed, one of the most glaring ones was the aid convoy that was supposed to head into Aleppo. Russia was besieging Aleppo, and they, after weeks of bargaining with the UN and over the Security Council, they agreed to let in a humanitarian aid convoy into besieged Aleppo. Russia, what did Russia do? It bombed the convoy. It followed the convoy live on Russian state television. It cut the feed of the convoy, and then it bombed it for 2 hours. And then it blamed the terrorists. Russia systematically targets civilians, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, breadlines. Then it denies that it committed these atrocities, and then it blames the atrocities on the people that are living in the areas that they've bombed. This is their doctrine. This is how they operate. This is their modus operandi. It's been consistent for years. Anyone who's tracked anything in Syria will tell you that the Russians bomb something, lie about it, and then blame the victims. And they did that with the conscious effort to defeat every single pocket of resistance against the Assad regime, their client vassal state in Syria, to the point of they would besiege, and they would starve, and they would bombard. And that was the tactic: besiege, starve, bombard. And once they besieged the area, they didn't just, well, you couldn't say it was indiscriminate bombardment. Yes, the bombardment was indiscriminate, but they did discriminate. They weren't bombing front lines, they were bombing hospitals. We know because every time a field hospital was opened and those locations were handed to the United Nations for protection, the Russians would ask the United Nations for those locations for protection, and then they would bomb those locations. This happened repeatedly, systematically, to the point that NGOs, including Médecins Sans Frontières, had to stop providing the locations, the coordinates to the United Nations, because that meant they were going to get bombed by Russia. It's as black and white as I'm explaining it to you. There's no ambiguity, there's no nuance in what was happening here. And we knew every step of the way that this was happening. We knew it was happening. I'm going to be critical of the US government here. Successive administrations, Democrat and Republican, decided that allying with Russia in Syria was a goal to achieve a counter-terrorism, war on terror goal in Syria. So they allied with Russia effectively while Russia was bombarding systematically civilians. Russia suffered no significant sanctions for its behavior in Syria. It suffered no accountability for bombing aid convoys, for bombing hospitals. Nothing. Not a single thing happened to Vladimir Putin and his regime. That was everything he needed to know, that he could act with total impunity. When it came to chemical weapons, yes, they were used by the regime, but they were launched from air bases where the Russians were. And then the Russians provided the diplomatic cover. So in Syria, they provided the firepower and the diplomatic cover, while Iran provided the troops. This gave us two things with the war in Ukraine. One, it taught Putin that he could act with total impunity when it came to war crimes and targeting civilians, that no one, not a single soul, not a single government was going to act to stop him. Not one. The second thing it taught him was that war is easy, and that all you have to do is besiege a civilian population, bombard it, starve it, target its critical infrastructure, and you will break the will to fight of the population. That's where he strategically miscalculated, because he wasn't supplying the manpower required to do that. Iran was sending in human wave attacks, tens of thousands of troops from poor backgrounds in Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, forcibly recruiting teenagers to be human wave attacks, to basically, so the Syrian rebels ran out of ammo. That's the point of these human wave attacks. They wore the Syrians down through Iranian manpower and Russian heavy bombardment. So it's not difficult to see Putin looking at Ukraine and thinking, there isn't a single person in the world that's going to stop me if I bomb a Ukrainian hospital tomorrow. And he was right there, because no one has lifted a finger to stop him personally. No one. But what he didn't understand was that the manpower losses would be significant and that Ukrainians would fight to defend their territory. It wasn't so much spoken about Syrian rebels who didn't have a proper army, who didn't have international military support, who didn't have diplomatic cover, didn't have any of this. They still managed to hold back the regime and its forces in towns like Ruta for 5 years. They managed to hold out under siege, bombardment, starvation. So Putin really, really underestimated what he was actually doing in Syria. And he tried to apply that same doctrine to Ukraine. And he has. He's been bombing hospitals. He's been bombing schools. He's been bombing breadlines. He's been bombing Holocaust memorial centers. This is what he's been doing. He's been committing crimes against humanity, systematic crimes against humanity, and war crimes. He's been doing so with his own justifications that he said very proudly in his speeches addressing the nation, that he's doing it because he doesn't believe that Ukraine exists. He doesn't believe that Ukrainian national identity exists. In fact, he believes that any expression of Ukrainian national identity is equivalent to Nazism. That's why they're talking about Nazism. It's not because of the 3,000, 4,000 members of the Azov battalion. It's because he believes that the Ukrainian national identity, any national identity that doesn't want to be subordinate to Russia, to Putin, to the Kremlin, is Nazism. And that's why he has focused his propaganda on this lie, this absurd, disgusting lie that Ukrainian people are all Nazis. It's a Nazi state. I can tell you myself the things that I've witnessed: Muslims, Jews, gays, lesbians, transgender people, all members of the territorial defense, fighting alongside each other in the defense of their nation. That's not a Nazi state. That's not a pure ethnic ethno-nationalism at play here. And I met immigrants, Libyan, who moved here 6 years ago after fighting Gaddafi, sought refuge and asylum here in Ukraine. Now he's decided, a Muslim Libyan has decided to join the territorial defense here. Again, this isn't a neo-Nazi. It's not someone who believes in the pure Aryan race. There are people like that exist in Ukraine, a small percentage of them. There are people like that exist in the United States of America. There are very many of them that tried to storm the Capitol on the 6th of January. We should not be surprised or shocked by the existence of far-right elements. What we should be judging is, as you said, Bhakti, what political power do they have in this country? None. They have no power. This country is led by a Jewish president. It's very clear that Russian propaganda is trying to insinuate, imply that it's fighting terrorists, Nazis, to dehumanize the Ukrainian people in order to justify its systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity against them. The question that I would like to pose to the Helsinki Commission is, at what point does the intent to destroy Ukraine as a nation, the intent to destroy Ukrainian national identity, systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity, at what point does that reach the threshold for genocide? The intent is there. It's absolutely there. From Putin's own words, from Putin's propagandists, the intent is there. The question is, what does this definition, if it's proved internationally, what does it even mean? What are we willing to do to end the war in Ukraine? I'm still yet to find out, other than weapons deliveries, what the plan is if Ukrainian defenses collapse. What's the plan for, if Russian troops end up on the Polish border? At what point are we just not going to stop reacting to things and start preempting things? Because anyone who covered the war in Syria and saw the war crimes there and saw the impunity that Putin got away with there could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't going to end in Syria. It's not going to end in Ukraine. And it goes further than that. I'm a British citizen. So in my lifetime, I've seen Litvinenko poisoned with a radioactive substance, and we've seen the attempted assassination of the Skripals with a chemical nerve agent, both on the streets of Britain. A radioactive and chemical weapon substance used by the Putin regime on the streets of Britain. This is not a regime that respects international norms. It's a fascist regime that uses international norms to exploit them in order to advance its goals strategically, politically, geographically. And I suppose my time here, you've seen the reports. You don't need me to reinforce them, but I've stood over the graves, the mass graves in Bucha. I've seen these civilians executed and lying in the streets. I've seen them with my own eyes. We know what Russia, I've heard the testimonies with my own ears of what Russian troops did to Ukrainian civilians. This is not a mystery. There's no ambiguity here. We know what happened. We know what happened. And my job now is to tell you from my experience that this isn't going to end here unless it's stopped. And I'm not a politician. I'm not the kind of person who can tell you all of the ways that the United States government can employ to stop this tyrannical fascist dictatorship from slaughtering its way through Europe. But it needs to act. And the president of Ukraine isn't constantly talking about the need for further weaponry and the further reinforcements if he didn't need them, and if he didn't think the situation wasn't grave. Right now, Russia's regrouping its strength and attacking the east. But no one should be under any doubts. Putin won't stop in the Donbass. He might declare a temporary victory, but he will come for Kiev again if nothing changes in the international world order. Putin has already been given impunity for decades now, and there has to be a line drawn in the sand. Right now, Ukraine is fighting for the entirety of the free world. The entirety of the liberal world order falls on the shoulders of Ukraine, which fights alone against a much stronger foe, which has decided that it wants to target its civilian population in order to destroy Ukrainian nationhood. Ukraine needs military aid, and it needs it now. Thank you.
Oz, thank you so much for this powerful and morally clear statement and, frankly, advocacy. We all are watching with horror what is going on, but I think one thing that you said is black and white. This is not a situation where we have to go and reassess again and see what is going on. People are dying, innocent people are dying, and the time to act now. And I think the most important thing that you said is not to be in this constant reactive mode. We're constantly reacting, and what you're saying is we need to be acting. We need to put them in a situation when they are reacting.
I want to go further. I want to say that the future of liberal democracy, it's dependent on what happens here in Ukraine. And if that worries you, if that terrifies you, then it should do. Because if you're not afraid, you haven't been paying attention to what's just happened since February 24th. The writing is clearly on the wall. Liberal democracy is at threat. Totalitarian regimes, Russia's not the only one, are circling the wagons now because they believe that liberal democracy can be destroyed. It can collapse. And we don't want to wake up in a world where that's the case. And it's imperative that liberal democratic nations learn how to respond to this and respond to this fast. It's imperative.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Asami, may I turn to you? You have a fascinating life story, a personal story. I think is really, really interesting and fascinating. If you could, again, because we're highlighting sort of diverse voices that are covering the war in Ukraine, can you speak a little bit about what you are seeing as a minority in Ukraine? What are you seeing on the ground? And what is it that you say to somebody who, I mean, sometimes is a well-meaning person who says, well, actually, there's an issue with the Nazis or far right in Ukraine. As a minority Ukrainian, I don't know if you're a Ukrainian national, but who's lived there for a long time, what is it that you see? What are you seeing on the ground?
Ukraine is the most freedom-loving country that I've ever lived in, that I've ever visited. Ever since the first days that I came here, Ukrainian people have treated me as one of their own, and Ukraine has been my home ever since. When I moved here at the age of 10, and so all these claims about Nazism, this has been crazy to me because it's just not true. And right now, since February 24th, the lives of Ukrainians and the lives of everyone living in Ukraine have completely changed, and we are right now, every single day, as the war continues, more Ukrainian civilians are dying and more cities are being destroyed, and the list of cities that are under siege just grows, and Russia is only intensifying this indiscriminate attacks against civilians, target civilians and civilian infrastructures, destroying hospitals, orphanages, schools, and just anything that they see. Because Ukraine's, compared to what we had in 2014, Ukraine's military is significantly stronger, and this has frustrated Russia. And Russia has, therefore, because it hasn't been able to achieve its goal that it thought was going to achieve in a very short time, it shifted its focus to civilian targets, and now we have the Battle of Donbass has begun on April 18th, and we know that hundreds of civilians are still there in the region, and we also know what's happening in the city of Mariupol in southern Ukraine, where there's an estimated 100,000 people still stuck in the city. Every single day, civilians are trying to evacuate, but Russia continues to shell people who are just simply trying to evacuate. And now we know that the reportedly last remaining Ukrainian defenders are now in Azovstal steel plant, trying to hold out Russian forces, but they are significantly outnumbered. And we also know that in this steel plant, there is more than 1,000 civilians, children, women, and elderlies who are still there, hanging on to hope that they could live and see the outside world. We still don't know the number of civilians who have been killed, and we also have a lot of people who have lost their homes, lost their cities, and have had to flee from where they grew up. I've taught for my reporting. I've been focusing on humanitarian stories, talking to the locals in various parts of Ukraine, starting from Donbass to Kharkiv, where it's the second largest city in Ukraine with a population of 1.4 million people, and yet every single day Russia continues to shell, even to intensify shelling in this Kharkiv city. And I've been talking to the survivors of Mariupol and the woman who survived the bombed drama theater in Mariupol, and from everyone that I talked to have shared me these heartbreaking stories, because behind every headline is a tragic humanitarian story that is yet to be uncovered. And this is what I'm focusing on right now, to talk to as many locals as possible, because yes, they have been through a lot. Many of them have lost their relatives, have lost their homes, and yet they try to rebuild their lives in some way. Because from what I learned from living over 12 years in Ukraine is that Ukrainian people are the most brave people that I've ever met. And even in such difficulty, people are not panicking. People are trying to stay calm as much as possible, because at the end of the day, panic does not yield to result, and everyone knows that staying united is the best way to move forward.
Asami, this has been incredible. I literally every sentence that you said could be a motivational poster, to be perfectly honest. I think the most freedom-loving people, I've known Ukraine for a long time. I have friends, former colleagues, and I 100% agree with your assessment. Most freedom-loving, fun-loving, outgoing people out there, and it's just tragic and painful to see what is going on. I think the point that you mentioned about rebuilding, I think sometimes, I see these posts about, a town or a village cleaning up, 2 days after a bombing, and it's just incredible. And I think the sense of pride in who they are and what they represent is just incredible. It just gives me, frankly, just thinking about it, talking about it, just gives me the goosebumps. Just the incredible, the spirit of the nation, and the fact that if somebody tries to deny this doesn't exist, to me is the most asinine and insidious thing out there. So This has been incredible. I think I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions for you and Oz, and Olga, I would like to turn to you, if possible. If you have been an incredible voice, and I think you've been reaching out, and you've reached to people, and people that I know were absolutely could not place a map, Ukraine on a map, or talking about you, frankly. And I think that's one of the things that you have been doing consistently and strongly. One thing that I would like to ask you, and I know if you don't want to talk about it, it's perfectly fine, but what was it like to wake up on the morning off on the 24th? What did it feel like? What were people saying? What was the mood? I mean, we saw people mobilize very quickly, but if you could talk about it a little bit and then discuss whatever else you're seeing on the ground. Again, we're here to listen to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahti, and thank you to other speakers, my colleagues who were speaking before me. I really appreciate what you said, and I agree with what has been said. And I want to thank you also, Asami, for your words that Ukrainians are the most freedom-loving people. I've been living in Ukraine like all of my life. I had a brief period of study abroad in Italy, and I made a conscious decision after graduating, despite the opportunities that I had to stay abroad, to continue, doing an academic career or any other career, to return to Ukraine and to contribute to the development of this country. That was back in 2013. And, the irony was that several months after I returned to Ukraine with this conscious decision to work here as a journalist, protests at Maidan Square began, the Revolution of Dignity. That was actually my second revolution. In 37 years of my life, I participated and I witnessed two revolutions in Ukraine. One was the Orange Revolution in 2004. I was still a journalism student back then. And, I was in the square distributing leaflets to the people who were camping there for weeks in freezing temperatures, people from all over Ukraine who protested against an attempt to rig the election, who wanted to have a free election, who were caring, about democratic process, who wanted to, return this right and give back this right, get back the right to have a free and fair election and to have the leaders that they want to have and they voted for, not that, someone who was decided on top here in Kyiv or maybe even in Moscow. So that was my first revolution. And the second was in 2013 and 2014, the Revolution of Dignity, when again Ukrainians protested against the decision of the government to reverse the course of its rapprochement with the European Union. Then Russian President Yanukovych decided that he would not sign an association agreement with the EU, and people protested against that because they saw the future of Ukraine in a family of free and democratic nations. And that protest ended in bloodshed when 100 protesters were shot in central square of Kyiv. I was, during those months, this revolution lasted for several months. I was there almost daily, reporting from there, writing, also like tweeting and talking to people, and just witnessing these historical events. Of course, me and no one, I think, in Ukraine at that point thought that the war is possible, that Russia would respond to this Ukrainians' desire to be, a free and democratic country, to be a part of the Western world, with military action. Russia annexed Crimea. Russia launched its special forces into Donbass to foment an uprising there, and also Russian citizens and Russian agents were participating in seizing of the governmental offices in Donetsk and Luhansk regions back in 2014. And since then, for 8 years, Russia has been financing, supplying the military forces fighting against the Ukrainian armed forces in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And since February 2014 of this year, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Well, I think maybe I was not, I was one of probably few people around me here in Ukraine who believed that Russia could launch this full-scale invasion. Most of my contacts, even journalists, were really they were refusing somehow to believe that all those warnings that, you know, we were receiving from the US or from the UK and from other Western countries' intelligence, they were true. So most people still, you know, I don't know, like it's difficult to explain why there was this sort of denial. Of course, the Ukrainian government also tried to downplay the risk, but even people who are very well informed, you know, who, as I said, my colleagues, journalists who are receiving, like reading the news and reading all these warnings from the Western intelligence, and they had no reason actually to doubt, you know, the authenticity of this data. They still somehow refuse to believe that the full-scale invasion and a full-scale war is possible. And I think it was because, you know, we are just like you. We lived in a country that was, you know, free and democratic. It was the country where we went to the elections every several years, where we elected our representatives. Ukraine is the country that had the freedom of speech, you know, that was functioning media, diverse media scene. Ukraine has a strong civil society with a lot of NGOs who kept the government accountable and reacted to any attempt to, you know, somehow concentrate the power or, I don't know, adopt some law that people didn't agree with. So we had this feeling that, like, we are a part of the free world. Of course, there are still a lot of problems with the corruption, with the other things, but we are fighting with that, and we are faring pretty well. Like, we are in our own house, and we are sorting out our problems, because in fact, despite the war that Russia launched back in 2014 on Donbass, Ukraine has been making remarkable progress in different areas since then, in the last 8 years. You know, Ukraine has seen a steady economic growth despite the pandemic. The IT sector in particular was booming in Ukraine, and many IT professionals emerged in these years who were working with various international companies, and a lot of Ukrainian IT startups also made their way onto the global scene. So, you know, a lot of people in Ukraine, they had this international exposure. They were working with colleagues in other countries, especially as the pandemic made online work something like normal and ordinary. And that's why I think for millions of my compatriots here, it didn't even occur that this, like, normality that we had, and the fact that, you know, the country is developing, that it's a free and democratic country, just like any Western country, that it could be somehow put in danger. Of course, we heard all the, you know, rhetoric coming from the Kremlin. We've heard Russian propaganda announcing their plans to attack Ukraine, but most people in Ukraine just shrugged it off. You know, they thought, well, they are just making a fuss, you know, for some domestic, for the domestic audience, for to consolidate the you know, the grab on power that Putin had. And I think this was, of course, something that for many it was a surprise. So, but as I said, I was an exception probably, because several days before Russia launched the full-scale invasion, I actually, you know, told my husband that we should take our kid and we have to go to our relatives in Western Ukraine. I don't know, like, how it happened, and I felt very guilty initially because no one around me was making a similar move. You know, people were just staying put, going to work, and even like those people I told about my decision, and I actually encouraged them to consider doing the same. But I felt guilty, and I felt a bit like silly, because I was like, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm overestimating it, you know, this threat. But I thought, okay, we will just do this, kind of go on a vacation to Western Ukraine, and we'll see what happens, because as I said, we have like relatives here. And on the morning of February 24th, I woke up it was still dark outside, so I think it was like 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., still pretty early. And the first thing I did was grabbing my phone, as I did on previous mornings. And then, yeah, I saw the news on the Interfax News Agency website that Russia started attacking from multiple directions. Like, I woke up my husband and I told him, like, it started, the war has started. And then after, like, I think 10 minutes, we were all, like, the relatives and us and everyone who lived in the same house in front of the TV and, you know, watching the latest news. And in the next hours, we were on the phones with our relatives and friends in Kyiv, telling them, come here, we have place for you, take your children. So, and even now, like in the house where we are staying here in Western Ukraine, we are hosting internally displaced people from Kyiv and the other Ukrainian regions, because this part of the country, Western Ukraine, has become a hub for millions of Ukrainians who are fleeing from other parts of the country. So, to cut the long story short, I just wanted, like, the message that I wanted to convey here today is that I'm in relative safety now. My family is in relative safety here in Western Ukraine. But in fact, no part of Ukraine is safe. Russia is launching missile strikes, missile attacks on the western part of the country, where millions of people fled, hoping that it would be safer. Just a couple of days before, Russia attacked Lviv, a major city in Western Ukraine, killing 7 people and injuring more than a dozen, including children. No part of Ukraine is safe. Of course, we are watching very closely and with huge anxiety what is happening, in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, in Donbass, elsewhere. We are very happy that Ukrainian armed forces managed to liberate the northern part of the country, that they kicked Russians out from Kyiv region, from Chernihiv region, from Sumy region. And actually, we've all seen what they did there, the horrific human rights violations, war crimes, execution of civilians, massive rape, looting, torture. Just today, I talked to a person from Chernihiv region whose brother is missing after being taken by Russian soldiers back on March 4th. So for a month and a half, he hasn't heard anything from his brother. And the brother was only taken by Russians because they suspected that he was passing some information to the Ukrainian armed forces. However, like, his brother says that he hasn't done anything like that. So they basically took people for no reason, and their relatives didn't know what happened to them. Another person who was taken with him was found murdered, killed on the position of where Russian troops were staying. All these stories are emerging every day, and we know that these things are continuing in those territories that are currently under Russian occupation, in the south of Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine. There are reports of kidnappings, disappearances, enforced deportations. 500,000 of Ukrainians have been forcefully deported to Russia against their own will, and these people are taking their documents from them, are taking their IDs. They cannot return to Ukraine. They're being sent to remote areas of Russia. So a massive scale of human rights abuses and repression that is going on now on the occupied territories. And if Russia is not stopped, if Russia is allowed to grab more Ukraine's territory, this is going to happen everywhere. I know that if Russia wins in Ukraine, if it's allowed to win in Ukraine, I will not be able to stay in this country. My life will be in danger. I'm not sure if I'll be able to survive, but I will, even if I will have to flee. I will have to go away. And so many of my, not just journalists, but many Ukrainians, not only activists, not only those who are fighting, contributing to the development of Ukraine, working in NGOs, working in human rights organizations, in the civil society organizations, journalists, they all definitely are the first targets of the Russians. But even, ordinary millions of Ukrainians who just hold the Ukrainian flag in their house, who speak Ukrainian language, who know the words of the Ukrainian national anthem, they will become targets as well. Russia will just perpetrate a genocide of a massive scale. I just want all of you to be conscious of this, that, Russia will not stop in Donbass. It will not stop somewhere. No one in Ukraine is safe and can be safe unless there is a defeat of Russia, unless Russia is defeated and Ukraine wins this war. We are not saying in Ukraine when this war ends. We are saying when Ukraine wins. And this should be also the desire and the goal, I think, of the all free world, to make everything possible so that Ukraine wins this war. Thank you.
Olga, thank you so much. I know it's hard for you to be talking about it. This is, for all of you, this is personal. This is not just a story that you're covering, you're living it. And I think for us, as much as we all, frankly, wake up in the morning and read the news, and the horrors that we see, they're painful, and anxiety that you're talking about, I think, is among everyone, but it's nothing compared to what you are doing and what you are living through. I cannot even imagine. So thank you all for your strength, and thank you all for continuing doing what you're doing despite all of the, I don't want to call them challenges. I mean, challenges when you have a difficulty. This is just a calamity. You're living through a calamity, and despite that you are continuing to do what you do is just incredible. I think one thing that you've pointed out, and I think this is really important, is Ukraine has changed its government. People in Ukraine changed its government twice. When Ukrainians are not happy, they will go do it. And I don't know how, frankly, stupid you have to be to assume that you can, do something, that you can just do something to people like that. People in Ukraine are freedom loving. They know what they want, and it's incredible. Ukraine is an inspiration to all of us, and Ukraine is an inspiration above all from what I'm seeing to Ukrainians, because even people, I know Ukrainians from all sides of walks of life, and people who used to argue with each other, fight with each other, disagree with each other from different parties. Everybody has come together. The unity is inspiring, and I think this is incredible. Just one note to everyone who is listening to this: if you have questions, please, we have a chat box. It would be to your right corner. So please type in your question, and I will ask our panelists this question. While you're thinking about your questions, Congressman Cohen, you've listened to this. I was wondering if you might want to offer any thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. I thank each of the three panelists for their testimony, for their courage. I think we all in America, not all of us, there's some of us that are out there on the crazies in our caucus, in our Congress, not our caucus, but in our Congress. But almost, I'd say 95% of the American Congress is supportive, and most of the American public. I see some Twitter messages sometimes from either Russophiles or Russian agents that make you wonder. But regardless, I appreciate it. Oz, and you in particular, I appreciated your testimony. I agree with everything you said. One of the privileges I have as co-chairman of the Helsinki Commission is to meet with some outstanding human beings who inspire me. One of whom is Bill Browder, who came and spent about an hour with me last week before he testified before our committee. Another is Kordakovsky, who spent about an hour with a couple of members of the commission and myself, and they were pretty much together on the idea that you expressed, that Putin is a mafia boss, he's a bully, and he can only be stopped with power. That Macron's talking to him every other day, which I don't think he's doing now. He's having to defend himself with Le Pen, but that Putin doesn't care, and he call him up and say, we're not going to go in and do anything. It doesn't help. He's only going to, there need to be red lines drawn. And one of the parties suggested we should have a red line in Odessa and say, if you cross this line and attack Odessa, we're going to take out your ships in the Black Sea. And then he's inevitably going to cross that red line, and then you got to take out his ships in the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians showed you could do it with Neptunes. We can do it with harpoons. It can be done easy enough, or it can be done with air flights. I don't think we should be concerned about that particularly. The other was a red line in Kharkiv. And if he attacks Kharkiv, you send in air power to destroy the air bases from which the planes came from, or the sites where the missiles came from. But you have to have red lines. You have to stand up, and you have to stop him. That's the only way he will ever communicate any kind of peace treaty. He is a liar. Nothing he says can be believed. And much of what we see today reminds us of Syria. Indeed, Syria was maybe the canary, a very loud canary that we should have listened to. Same thing for Georgia. Same thing for Chechnya. We've seen it. America, in many ways, is fortunate this war is occurring. I hate to say it, but we're having an inevitable war with Russia, with Ukrainian troops and not NATO troops, not American troops. And all we need to do is supply them with weaponry. I can understand the concern about a no-fly zone, but I can never have understood publicly talking about the Polish MiGs and the questions of whether they should be turned over in Poland or whether they should be turned over in our base in Germany. We should have found a way to do it. And apparently we're finding a way to get our military equipment into Ukraine to help the Ukraine military. Now this quote unquote, we talk about the $800 million package, and then the next $800 million package, which contains X, Y, and Z. No airplanes, I don't believe, but who knows what'll end up happening. I don't see how they get it into the Ukrainians, particularly in eastern Ukraine. We've waited too long. And I wonder if any of the three of y'all have any idea about or have seen any convoys of equipment going? Oz, please tell me about it. Teach me.
Yeah, so from my understanding, from my contacts in Ukraine, I understand that there have been steady supply of shipments of weaponry traveling from Poland into Ukraine, and that not one of those convoys has been targeted by Russian fire in the entire duration of the war. I understand that Reuters confirmed this, that Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones, that further of those have been delivered by the Turkish supplier, and they traveled in through Poland, through the west of the country. So as far as I understand it, the Turks, the Eastern Europeans, are proving that there can be supply lines of heavy weaponry, game-changing weaponry heading into the country from the west, from Poland, and that those convoys can be protected from Russian strikes. Our partners in Europe and are proving that it can be done, and really, America needs to
We need
show
upward.
show the courage of its convictions. Currently, it lacks the courage of its convictions. If America wants Ukraine to win this war, it needs ammunition. Ukraine needs ammunition. It needs material. It needs tanks. It needs fighter jets. It needs the kinds of things that will strike fear into the hearts of an already much stronger army. That's what will make the difference here. Ukrainians have already got the manpower and the will to fight in a way that's terrified the Russians, but they don't have the equipment that they need. And the one thing that we're not talking enough about is that while the equipment is very good, that's the list of equipment it's being sent slowly, and that equipment only lasts a week and a half, 2 weeks in the war here. There needs to be more, much more, and it might be unpalatable for people to hear talk of weaponry being sent to an active conflict, but this is democracy versus totalitarianism. It's light versus darkness. We have no choice but to support the Ukrainian people in this to the point of victory, and anything less than that will be a disaster for the entire European project.
I totally agree with you, and I would suggest, I've been disappointed, and I hate to say this, I'm a Democrat, I'm an American, all those things, but I've been disappointed with the response from Jump Street, our intelligence and our Defense Department, and so many people want to stand up and go, oh, our Defense Department and our administration, our intelligence, salute. They were wrong from Jump Street. They said that it would be 24 to 48 hours and Kyiv would fall. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they said it'll be 10 days to 2 weeks and Kyiv will fall. Intelligence was wrong. Defense was wrong. State Department was wrong. When one of our members suggested we should send in better weaponry, better air defense weaponry early on, the response from state, kind of under their breath, but it was audible and clear to me, was we don't want to risk sending that weaponry because they will fall so quickly to the Russians. The Russians will have our weaponry, and they will have our knowledge of the technology of the weaponry, and they will have the weaponry. Because of that, they don't have it. They didn't have it, and they don't have it because our intelligence was wrong. They could not understand a determined and motivated group that would fight for liberty and for their country and for their identities, as the Ukrainians have. They couldn't see that for some reason. I have to say, I said this early on. We were in Lithuania before the war broke out, and it might have broken out. We were there, give or take, when it broke out. We might have been in Vienna. But I told a Lithuanian press assembly that we might be underestimating what Ukraine can do, because a motivated group can do so much more. And I have to admit, I was thinking a little bit in my own perspective as a sports fan, and I know how a team that's under appreciated and not as strong as the other team can be fired up to beat the stronger team and to play at home and to have the home court advantage, and they can do miraculous things. And I thought the same thing could happen here, and it did happen here. But we've been wrong. As you say, we're getting the equipment in. I'm sure we are. But are we getting it to the east? How do you get it into the east when the one side is Russia and the other sides are Russian troops now trying to cut the Ukrainian troops off? How do you get into Donetsk and Luhansk? How are the weaponry getting in there, do you think?
So those areas still aren't encircled. The front lines are still available, but obviously trying to get weapons like that into Mariupol would be, not feasible. But we're at a critical junction now in time where these front lines are still accessible. Are we going to wait 2 weeks before maybe 100,000 Ukrainian troops are surrounded due to a Russian offensive? We don't want to wait for that point to happen. So it really is we are at a critical junction of this war. Ukraine can win with support. It's about getting that support there now, not tomorrow, not the day after, now.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I hope we can get it in. It seems like the administration's waking up somewhat to this current announcement. They're going to send in this additional $800 million, and they're going to do it quickly as they can. But we've been slow, and the administration's been slow, and I blame intelligence, defense, state, the whole crowd. And they're starting to wake up a bit. We're lucky that the Ukrainians are there to fight the Russians. All we need to do is give them the weapons. We need to get them the tanks. We need to get them the howitzers. We need to find a way to get them the airplanes they can fly. And if not, we need to teach them how to fly the airplanes, or maybe send an aide to go in with them in the airplane. We don't know who in the hell that guy is if something happens. But we need to get support there. Mariupol, those are such courageous men and women, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. And they're fighting. And I don't think there's much we can do at this point. Oz, you remind me a lot of my dear departed friend Christopher Hitchens. Not just your accent, but your knowledge, your clear message about what needs to happen, and good versus evil, and light versus dark. Christopher spoke that way as well, and he was one of my dear friends. I don't know.
I'm friends with his son, so.
Oh, excellent.
Alexander.
Do you know the Coburn family, or do you know of the Coburn family?
As in Patrick Coburn, and yeah, I'll have to be honest with you, particularly given his testimony to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK. His position on the Assad regime is one of the worst of any mainstream reporter working in the Middle East today. I'm not a fan of Patrick Coburn's work. I think he's very sympathetic towards the Assad dictatorship.
Well, I appreciate your candor. I know Patrick through Christopher. Patrick had a much severe case of polio than I had, but I had polio, and I have post-polio, so I have problems occasionally. But Patrick has unbelievable problems to surmount. Even getting up is difficult for him. His brother Andrew is coming to visit in Memphis for the next 4 days. He's coming in tonight, and we're going to spend a lot of time together. I didn't know Alexander, but they're a great family, and they, of course, Andrew is more sympathetic, knowledgeable about military weaponry, and that's a lot we'll discuss in the next 3 or 4 days. But thank you very much. And Olga, I can't imagine, this is your country now, and Asami, it's yours too. And to have to give up your country has got to be just the possibility of having to leave is awful. I mean, a lot of what we have is our memories, our possessions, store in them memories, our friends, sites that we think of and remember events at, and they are parts of our lives. And to have to leave that, which so many Ukrainians have, is reprehensible. It's awful. It's giving up much of their life. There are many deaths. There are little deaths, and Putin doesn't care. I have been a strong, vocal critic of Donald Trump. And I think a lot of what we're seeing today is because of Donald Trump. I think we didn't stand up with Ukraine when Trump was president. Instead, we tried to use them as a way to get Hunter Biden dirt or something that they thought was dirt. And we didn't care about Ukraine, and we treated them as a political opportunity. At least Trump did. And the Republicans, not all, but most, did not impeach him for that because they were surety to his actions, and they were cowards to what is really a totalitarian, dictating, grifting, lying MF who was president of the United States. And he's no different than Putin and Orban and them. Oz, you're on.
I'd like to echo your sentiments. I completely agree. But speaking as a Brit, so I don't have any partisan affiliations here. Well, I mean, I endorsed Hillary Clinton for president in 2016. Not that my endorsement as a British journalist makes much difference. But I want to say that I think it would be unfair to let the Obama administration off the hook, including Biden, for the way that they treated and reacted to the invasion of Donbass and Crimea in 2014 that happened under Obama's watch. And I feel like if the diplomatic response had been stronger, that we would be in a better position that we are today. And it's not about assigning blame. It's about learning where the mistakes were made and trying to stop them from happening in the future.
Well, you're right, Oz, and I was with a former Obama cabinet official the other day, and he said to me that Obama often said to him, what we did was not necessarily what we aimed to do, and it wasn't perfect, but it was better. And it's doing better is good. Better is good, but when you settle for better, you're letting problems fester, and they're going to come back on you in the future. And we had a lot of that then. That was not a perfect administration either. It was better, and the fact is they didn't win. They didn't have a Senate for after a while. They had a Senate for a couple of terms, and we lost the House. And there's only so much you can do. Biden beat Trump. And I don't know if another candidate would have beaten Trump. Maybe they would have. But simply by stopping Trump from having another term makes Biden a great president, a great figure. Maybe not a great president, but a great figure. I'm concerned about 2022 and losing the House and losing the Senate. And I'm concerned about 2024 if that happens. I talked to Michael Cohen on occasionally, Trump's former consigliere. He doesn't think Trump will run because he couldn't stand the idea of being defeated. But if he sets up and gets the Secretary of States elected that agree with him, and they change the rules in the states, which they've done, on how they determine who's in the electors at the Electoral College, he won't have to worry about losing because he'll steal it, just like he tried to do on January 6th. We had a coup d'etat. It failed. And the Republicans in our Congress are not willing to admit it or stand up to it because some of them are complicit. And there's a lot going on that's very scary in our country. And I'm concerned about our Congress. I'm concerned about our future and where we'll be. But we need to stand strong. And I think we're going to get Ukraine help. Hopefully it's going to be sufficient and we can stop the Russians because they're going to go back into Estonia. I was in Estonia not long ago, a year or so. And they talked about how the Russians came in. The Russians sent Russians into Estonia. And there's a large part of the eastern edge of Estonia that's Russian occupied. And we drove through there. And the people were walking around and they were like Russian style architectural, if you call it architecture, almost an oxymoron, Russian architecture, but that functionality and all the buildings looked like that. And the people were walking around. They looked like what you saw in movies of Russia from other days. They will move people in to try to take over and they're trying to kill Ukrainians. They're happy when Ukrainians evacuate. They want them to leave the country and not to come back, and they want to kill them if they're there. And they will send Russians, they will move them into Ukraine to take over and make it a Russian state. So it's scary, and they will go to Estonia. I was in Lithuania. They've moved their troops in Belarus right to the edge of border of Lithuania. They've taken over the old Soviet forts, and they will come into Lithuania. And then we'll have to have a ground war and a war, but it'll happen. And it's better to fight it in Ukraine than to fight it with our troops, et cetera, in Estonia and Lithuania, which would happen in Poland and wherever. This is the crucial moment in the fight for democracy and the fight for the West. So thank you all.
Thank you, Congressman Cohen. Thank you, Co-Chair. You've always provided clear guidance on what priorities when it comes to Ukraine should be, and we appreciate your leadership on all of these. And frankly, not being afraid to be critical of this administration. We appreciate everything that you've done. I have a couple of questions for our witnesses. Asami, maybe I think since you mentioned you're talking to people who've been through the horrors of the Russian invasion, how do you interview people with sensitivity and professionalism, people who have suffered incredible trauma, right? People who you're talking to, they've lived through just horrors. How do you interview them? And are people willing to be interviewed to share their stories with you? How is that working?
So I think it really depends on how you approach them, because as a reporter, the most important thing is for me to make the interviewee feel comfortable telling the story, because if she or he is not comfortable talking about it, then I would rather, they need space. So I think first I would ask for permission and try to make them feel as comfortable as possible. And many of the people that I've been talking to, they were openly talking about what they've been through, and they've even invited me to their houses and showed all the destructions that the Russian occupiers have left, because they want people to know, they want the world to know what happened to their towns, what happened to their people. And I think that in a way it was also therapeutic for them, because many of them, after having the interview, they began to smile and talk to me about other things and ask me questions about why I'm here in Ukraine and what I'm doing here. And this, we became friends at the end of the interview. So as a reporter, this is the most important thing for me, is to build personal connection with the people that I'm talking to, and to make them feel as comfortable as possible, and to make sure that we're documenting as many Russian war crimes as possible, because we need the world to witness everything that they're doing here. And we need to make sure that Russia is paying for all the Ukrainian blood that is spilled on our land. And I wanted to add to the previous conversation, even though the challenges are significant, and every single day we in Ukraine, it's a very difficult moment for all of us. And every day we wake up to news about, what happened in, let's say, Eastern Ukraine. Or the other day I woke up reading about the missile attacks that hit Lviv, the western city, where, there's at least 350,000 people who have been evacuated from Eastern Ukraine. So there's lots of people living there, thinking that it will be safe, and all of a sudden they are hit with a missile strike. So nowhere in Ukraine is safe, as Olga said, but the morale remains high. And according to a survey according to a survey released about 3 weeks ago, over 90% of the people in Ukraine believe that Ukraine will win. But we all know that there's uncertainty about what will happen, and we know that difficult months are ahead, if not maybe even a year or even more. We don't know how long this lasts, and every single day that this war continues, more civilians are dying, more towns and more cities are being under siege and being destroyed, and more families are being disrupted, and more children are dying, because this war only also affects children and the future generations of Ukraine. Right now, what we need is ammunition, as you said, and also we need fighter jets as soon as possible. And right now, Russia's air force is unfortunately more than 10 times larger than the one that we have in Ukraine. And Russia has so far not been able to achieve total air supremacy, because the Ukrainian airspace is still being contested, but Russia does enjoy air superiority in Ukraine, and they have been as you can see, they have been shelling, launching rocket attacks all across Ukraine, even in the western part of the country. So we need fighter jets as soon as possible. We need more tanks. We need more heavy weaponries, and some Western officials are afraid that sending fighter jets would escalate the war, but this is in fact not true, because the fighter jets are not so significantly different from the heavy weapons that the West is already sending, and the West is, I hope, will be sending more in the future. So we need weapons as soon as possible, because peace talks with Russia are, like, unfortunately, we don't have high hopes for it, and there's no reason for us to believe what Russia is saying, and we will never believe what promises that they will make.
Thank you so much, Asami. Olga, if I may direct this question to you, we have a question. Have you or your colleagues found that Russian forces are deliberately targeting journalists? I know there were multiple deaths, but can you speak to how deliberate the Russian forces are in their targeting of journalists?
Yes, that's a very important question. And in fact, we've seen that many journalists were already killed in this war. By the Ukrainian government counts, it's about 20, but they are also counting those journalists who were killed as a result of explosions in their cities. So not like, while they were performing their duties as journalists. But we can definitely speak about at least several instances when journalists were deliberately killed by Russians while in the field, while working. And one of such cases is a Ukrainian photographer, Max Levin. We worked together at Hromadske, an independent Ukrainian TV station. Max was one of the most brilliant Ukrainian photographers. He covered the war since 2014. He survived the Ilovaisk massacre when Ukrainian troops were surrounded, and Russians promised a safe passage for them, but instead they were ambushed, and many, like hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were killed. In Ilovaisk, Max was there. He miraculously escaped alive from Ilovaisk. And since then, he was working on, several projects related to Ilovaisk and also in general to Russian war in Ukraine. So a person with a lot of, experience of working in conflict zones, a person who knew how to move, who, was trained who was familiar with all the safety protocols for journalists working in a war zone. He disappeared. He went missing in mid-March in the northern suburbs of Kyiv, and then several weeks later, after Russian retreat from those areas, his body was found there with gun wounds. So he died after being shot by Russian soldiers. Max, of course, was wearing all the, recognition marks. He was wearing protective gear, but it didn't help because it seemed that Russian soldiers deliberately, targeted and killed him as a journalist. And he's just one example. There were other journalists, both Ukrainian and foreign, who were killed deliberately by Russians. Mostly in areas around Kyiv. In the first months of the war, there are also multiple cases of the abduction, kidnappings of journalists in the occupied territories of southern Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv region. Parts of the latter two are under control of the Russian occupying forces, and we are hearing, very worrying reports about the abduction of journalists. And just today, actually, I didn't have time to read more about this story, but I saw that a blogger in Kherson was shot dead in his car. So, it seems that Russians are deliberately targeting journalists. They want the world to, not to get the truth about what is happening. In fact, we know that also journalists in Mariupol, two Associated Press photographers, photo reporters who are present there in February and in March, and who, reported the bombing of the maternity hospital, who documented it, who took photos and videos of that, who also documented the bombing of the drama theater in Mariupol. Later, when they had to flee, actually, Mariupol, they had to escape the city because Russians basically were looking for them, were hunting for them. So they got tipped off by the Ukrainian police and Ukrainian forces that they have to get out, and they were like a passage was organized for them. Like somehow these Ukrainian forces managed to take them out from Mariupol. And they were telling like a very detailed account of how they were working in Mariupol and how Russians were looking for them. So it's a deliberate tactic, to target journalists, independent journalists, journalists of foreign outlets, also Ukrainian journalists, those journalists who are reporting the truth. But at the same time, we have to say that Russia is also facilitating the access to territories that it occupies to so-called journalists who are in fact propagandists, not just from Russia, but also from China. We've seen the reporters of Chinese state media who are in Mariupol and in other areas under Russian control, of course, making reports about the Russian liberators and how local population is happy that Russians came and are liberating them from the Ukrainian Nazis. Well, obvious propaganda. But what is the most worrying is that not only Russian and Chinese journalists are doing that. Okay, not journalists. They are propagandists. But there are also Western ones. There is Graham Phillips, the UK, I don't know how to call him, definitely not a journalist, someone who was pushing Russian propaganda since 2014. There are Italian journalists also in Mariupol and in Russian occupied territories who are in Italy polluting the information space with all the, crazy conspiracies, Russian narratives. And in general, they are distorting the picture, and and the fact that they are getting invited on major TV shows, also on mainstream television, sometimes also on the public TV. This is something really very worrying. So there is a huge propaganda and disinformation war going on in the West as well, and I think we should be also cautious about that, and should be paying attention to that, and should be asking questions. How is that possible? How these people get there? What are they doing there? How Russians facilitate and enable their work? And I have, my reasons to believe that they are not doing that for free either. And also, how the governments should react to this, and also the media. They shouldn't be given a space, given airtime, given a platform to these people. Of course, big tech has a responsibility as well, because we know that YouTube, for example, provides a platform to these people who earn money, who with this spreading this genocidal propaganda. So that's another issue, but still very, very important.
Olga, I think you've just absolutely correct in that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, is because, again, as I pointed out, people who have access to free information are spreading the same narratives. I mean, people who should know better, deliberately, like you pointed out, sometimes maybe not deliberately. But the point is, again, we wanted to highlight you, the three of you, as the voices who are on the ground, who are talking to different people, who are a diverse set of people who are in Ukraine. And yet there's, like I pointed out, there's a unity in your narrative. And it's not because somebody's telling you, but because you are telling the truth. One question that I got from YouTube comment is, and I think this is seems like somebody from the United States. They're asking a very specific question in a very sort of American way. What is one thing you would like to see the United States and its allies to do in Ukraine in terms of aid? I think, Asami, you mentioned the jets. I mean, please feel free to add anything else. But what is the one thing? And I realize it's one thing is never a one thing. But what would you like to see in the next 2 weeks? Because as all of you pointed out, the next 2 weeks are going to be very critical to the war.
I'll go first. I'll offer you three things. That's fighter jets, anti-aircraft systems, and man-portable air defense systems, manpads. They need them now.
I would agree with that. We need fighter jets as soon as possible, and anti air defense and everything. We need all the all the heavy weaponry that is needed to protect Ukraine, because we need to end this war as soon as possible. But I think another important thing that is often not talked about enough is about for people all over the world to continue thinking about Ukraine and to continue having interest in what's happening here. Because if it goes away, then it's even more difficult to, impose tougher sanctions or alienize Russia from the rest of the world. So we need everyone, like whether you're a student or whether you're working already, everyone to think about what's happening in Ukraine every single day and continue keeping up with the news.
I
Perfect.
would
Thank you.
I think the US should be working more closely and talking more persuasively with the European partners, especially with Germany. The German government is really very, very reluctant and very disappointing and, unwilling to provide Ukraine with heavy weapons. Germany is the only basically European country with a major significance who is against oil and gas embargo on Russia. Of course, it will have costs for Germany, but the costs for Ukraine and potentially for Europe and the free world are much higher. So I think the US should be working, like persuading Germans, persuading European allies to take a more harsh stance on Russia, to somehow wake up to their reality. Because I have a feeling that while Americans, and people in the UK have better understanding of what is happening, I have a feeling that many continental Europeans, especially in Western Europe, they are still in denial. They still live in a very dangerous illusion, they have very naive approach to what is happening. I hear, when I hear suggestions that Ukraine should just surrender for the sake of saving lives, this is so dangerously naive. If Ukrainians surrender, there will be no more Ukraine, and Ukrainian lives will be even more in danger. Now there is a hope for these lives to be saved, but if Russia is allowed to win, it's the end of Ukrainians. They will just have a carte blanche for a genocide. So somehow I think there should be more like stronger transatlantic communication, cooperation, and action on Ukraine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. One very quick question from a Senate staffer. Are they asking, is it helpful when European leaders or any other political leaders visit Ukraine? Does it strain the are there logistical challenges that are associated with it? Are there any negatives? I mean, all they can see is a positive. Is there anything negative to political leaders from the West or frankly from anywhere in the world who are friendly to Ukraine visiting Ukraine? Is that a good thing? Is that a helpful thing?
I think it's a good thing as long as it's backed up with an increase in support. If you want to come here for a photo opportunity, as powerful a symbol as that is for the Ukrainian people, a photo is not going to change the course of the war. But if you're turning up with a lorry of 20 MiG fighter jets behind you, then yeah, come for the photo op. More the merrier.
I also
Yes,
agree that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, Sami, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that yes. I agree with us that yes, it's good. I think there's more benefits of world leaders visiting Kiev and meeting President Zelensky themselves, and because this shows solidarity, how the world is united. The world is showing a united front against Russia, but they need to come with more sanctions. I think, and also for more promises on weapon deliveries and more actions on how to help Ukraine.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues, and I would just add that Russians are really nervous when they see all these foreign leaders visiting Kyiv, because they get the feeling that the world stands with Ukraine, and also they hold off their missile attacks that they would otherwise be launching. They are really they are uneasy with the thought of hitting Kyiv or hitting Ukrainian railways where there might be a train where some Western leader is inside. So more of these visits are needed, because this also increases somehow security of Ukraine, I would argue. And of course, Joe Biden would be very welcome to visit Kyiv. I know that many Ukrainians would see it as the most powerful signal that could be sent.
It really is. I mean, Joe Biden is different. I don't think Schultz is going to get a very merry reception here at the moment, or Macron for that matter. But but to visit from Biden would be very different. Put it that way.
Great, thank you so much. And I know we're running out of time, but one more question, and I'm being very frank here. This is a bit of an unfair question, so feel free to answer or not answer this question. But one of the questions that I got was, do you think we need to engage Russians on the propaganda war? Because the question is, they seem to be, the vast majority of them, according to polls, seem to be completely brainwashed. Is it a waste of resources and time to try to convince them otherwise, that what's happening in Ukraine is potentially a genocidal war, that they're killing Ukrainians, raping babies? Is this worth engaging the Russian citizens who may, the idea being that they may potentially then put pressure on the government?
So my
With the
feeling
unfair
about
question, but yes, please.
my feeling about that's very clear. I would recommend people read Hannah Arendt on the origins of totalitarianism. I believe that Russia is a fascist military dictatorship in the same vein that the Third Reich was in 1940. I believe that trying to convince these people who are brainwashed that their government is committing fascist crimes is a waste of time, a waste of resources. The only language that Russia will understand is a military defeat. That's the only language they'll understand. And the longer that we keep prevaricating, wasting time, thinking that there's an alternative solution, that maybe we can, have a diplomatic breakthrough by talking to Russian people about this. It's a fantasy, and it's at this point it's insulting to the Ukrainian people, in my opinion.
Olga, Simon, do you any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, I think this question partially stems from the recent proposal of Alexei Navalny, a Russian opposition leader who is now jailed, to dedicate more resources not into buying javelins for Ukraine, but into investing to combat Kremlin propaganda. This idea was not very well received here in Ukraine, because it was seen as if somehow Navalny saying that, well, it doesn't really make much sense to arm Ukraine. You should rather work with Russian people. So while, of course, definitely there is a need to work with Russian society, I think that in fact, there is so much evidence of, that even those Russians who know what is happening in Ukraine, who get this information from their relatives in Ukraine, or, their former friends in Ukraine, so they have access to information, but they refuse to believe that this is actually happening. So they choose actually to believe Russian state propaganda, because that somehow absolves them of responsibility and of the need to react. So people in Russia, many of them know what is happening, but they choose to turn a blind eye to it, because somehow, if they endorse the position of the Russian government and they support this war, well, then they do not feel that somehow it's their responsibility to stop it. So unfortunately, Russian imperialism is not something new. It is not something that only Putin now is doing. For centuries, Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, now post-Soviet Russia had an imperialistic attitude, a colonial attitude to Ukraine. It exterminated, Ukrainians in many campaigns, artificial famine in the 1930s, repressions against Ukrainians, gulags for Ukrainian intelligentsia in Soviet times, just to name a few, over the last 100 years. So the problem is so deep-rooted. It's not, we cannot, absolve Russians of responsibility by saying that this is just because they are watching propaganda and they do not know what is happening. Many of them know what is happening. They endorse this war, or at least they choose to ignore it and not react to it, because deep down they are imperialists and they support this Russian imperialist attitude to Ukraine. I think Russia must be defeated militarily, and then Russia should undergo, the Russian society as well, the process of, the crimes should be punished, perpetrators should be brought to justice, an international tribunal should be established, and there should be a vast debate and a reflection in the Russian society about what led to this war, about the whole ideology, Russian imperialist ideology. It should be abandoned. There are no easy solutions, and just like investing in combating propaganda will not solve this.
I agree with my colleagues as well. Trying to engage with the Russian public who have been, who grew up listening and watching this Russian propaganda is practically impossible. And there's no point as well, because we need to focus on other efforts to help Ukraine, to directly help Ukraine. And there's so many things that the world should do rather than, trying to engage with the Russian people and let them understand what's happening in Ukraine. Because as Olga said, majority of them support the Russia's war against Ukraine. Majority of them know what's happening in Ukraine, and yet they don't stand up against it. I have a friend. I used to live in Moscow myself. I grew up there in my childhood as well, and they'll tell me that they don't want to see what their country is doing, what their soldiers are doing, because they cannot do anything about it. So many of them don't. They are, even if they do know, they don't want to directly engage to stop the war or speak up against it. So there are so many other things that the world should be doing rather than trying to convince the Russian public about stopping their government and stopping their soldiers.
This has been incredible. Thank you so much. Very, very clear answers to the questions to the difficult questions that we had here on the panel. I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Ukraine is going to prevail, that Ukraine is going to win. There's no question in my mind, and everyone that I talked to on the Hill, with the administration, there's just no question that it's going to happen. The question is, it's the cost that the Ukrainians are they will bear in the process, and how many lives are going to be sacrificed, frankly, before this goal is achieved. Ukrainians will win. Ukraine as a nation will continue. There's no question. But from what we're hearing today from you is we need to do more to make sure that the costs that are incredible already, that are just unbelievable already, that they are not continuing to multiply. And that's the message that we're going to take away from this, and that's the message that we're going to continue using and continue employing in shoring up support for Ukraine, for even more support. And I know if Congressman Cohen is with us, but as he pointed out, a lot of things that, again, even within the certain parties, it's not a partisan issue. 95% of Congress, as he said, is on board. So more support is going to come. And your testimonies today will, no doubt in my mind, will contribute to that. So thank you so much for having this incredibly difficult conversation. And I'm really hoping the next one that we're going to do maybe in Kiev or maybe somewhere in Ukraine. Maybe we do it in person. And, because these conversations are important. I think, as Sami, as you point out, it's really important that the world, does not turn away. This is happening, and people are dying, and we need to continue be talking about this, and your contributions are immeasurable from what you do day to day, and from this panel. Frankly, I mean, this is just one effort, but what you do day in and day out is incredible. So from the bottom of my heart, and from the commission, on commission's behalf, on all the commissioners that we have, and as you guys know, we're both Republican and Democrat. We are nonpartisan, but we are both bicameral. We have the members of Congress, we have senators. So on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for doing this. If you have any parting words that you would like to share with us, please do so. And we are already running out of time, but we're here to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you as well. I just wanted to say glory to Ukraine and glory to the heroes, as we say here in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for the Commission for having me. If there's anything you can take away from this, it's that I believe Ukraine can win this war with material aid that it needs. And I urge Western capitals to hear the cry from Ukraine for the aid that it needs to win this war, the war of extermination against its people.
Yeah, I just want to say that I wish everyone in the world believe in Ukraine's victory as much as the Ukrainians themselves do.
Absolutely. That's an incredible incredible statement to close out this this briefing. Thank you so much once again. Please feel free to reach out with, and I think, you know, we might have some follow-up questions, so I might come back to you with some questions from staffers and members of Congress. But again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. Most importantly, stay safe. Everyone, you, your loved ones, everyone you know, but also all of Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.